Meditations with Ryan Zlomek.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to episode 37 of Meditations. I'm your host, Ryan Zlomek, and this is a show all about making space for conversation just to see what we can learn from one another. And guess what? If you're looking at a calendar or you're looking at this on the drop date, you'll know that this is the last episode of 2024. And I gotta say, for the show, 2024 has been a huge year for meditations. It's made it to over 40 countries. It's made it to thousands and thousands of downloads. And I just want to say thank you, thank you, thank you. And if you're tuning in for the first time, thanks for tuning in for the first time. You're part of this 2024 success, and I greatly appreciate you. But this show's not about me. It's about the cool people that come on the show, so let's jump into it. On today's show, we have Grady Hendrix. Grady Hendrix is the New York Times bestselling author of such books as Horror Store, My Best Friend's Exorcism, We Sold Our Souls, How to Sell a Haunted House, and he's soon dropping Witchcraft For Wayward Girls, which will be coming out in January of 2025. Though it sounds like this is a dude who's obsessed with spooky stuff, well, I guess we're correct. He is obsessed with spooky stuff. He's a master of all mediums, whether we're talking about experimental theater or we're talking about writing just interesting media journalism, being involved in comics or cookbooks, but most importantly, taking the tropes that we think about for any sort of story, in this case horror stories, and figuring out how we can research such things to make it truly an immersive, unique experience for the reader. So if you're listening to this and you're like, I have no interest in something scary right before the holidays, well, you're in luck, because Grady is a welcoming and fun and, dare I say, quirky, eccentric personality. So without further ado, enough with this Ryan Zlomek stuff. Let's jump into this awesome interview with New York Times bestselling author Grady Hendrix. Grady Hendrix, it's an honor to have you on the podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in. And I'm assuming you're beaming in from Manhattan right now?
Yes, I am in the my small office in Manhattan.
Love it. So you're a Charleston, South Carolina guy, from what I understand. Um,
Yeah, born and
and
raised.
yeah, and I was very curious about sort of growing up in that environment. I know you had three sisters, and your dad was a cardiologist. Your mom had a slew of really cool professions. What was your sort of childhood like, kind of kicking things off in Charleston?
It was pretty typical for, a suburban childhood in the 70s into the 80s, that kind of you were unleashed and told to be home in time for dinner. So it was a lot of sort of roaming around with friends. We lived in England for about a year when I was a kid in the 70s, which was really, really formative for me. It was just really amazing to sort of be in another country and just have all the sort of familiar references and landmarks gone and have to sort of relearn them. And I was a big library kid. Like, I spent tons of time in libraries. Charleston has a lot of libraries, weirdly enough. And so my parents got divorced when I was pretty young, and that means you're always sort of waiting for someone to pick you up. So I usually waited in a library. So I spent, hundreds of hours in the downtown library or the Library Society or the College of Charleston Library or the Medical University Library.
Interesting. I'm always curious about sort of the culture of libraries, like, and especially as you were like a library nomad, was there certain things that you found at particular libraries, or with like their
Oh
librarians that you'd
yeah.
sort of form connections with?
Yeah, no, it was, I mean, you knew librarians, but it was really like the medical university library was the toughest because it was a serious teaching hospital library. But usually the psychology section would be kind of fun. There was a section, and I used to know my Dewey Decimal better than I do now. But there used to be a section on like the history of medicine, which is a lot of like history of plagues and things, which was fun. Um, the College of Charleston Library was where I went for periodicals. They had a huge drama section, but they also subscribed to things like the Village Voice and American Theater Magazine and Tulane Drama Review and stuff. That I was a big theater nerd. And then the downtown library was sort of everything else. And I had the sections I would go to. I would always like there was always sort of that folklore and occult section in the early Dewey Decimals. They used to have a lot of really weird albums, and I would check out a lot of albums. There was the history section was a big stop off for me, and then always the performing arts section. Like the for books about movies and plays and things like that. So like I would different. I had my little my route I would travel.
That's awesome. And we're going to talk about your sort of research practices now. Like late in this interview, I should say a little bit later, like what you do when you're kind of researching things, because I'm fascinated with the way in which you are able to bring everything together. So the fact that you were going to like different libraries for different sections and then different sections within these libraries to sort of find I don't know,
Right.
interesting connections for things is fascinating. When did your sort of interest in writing really kick off? Like, was it when you were young?
No, I really wanted to direct theater when I was a kid. Like I was big on I was a big theater nerd. And so I did a lot of theater in high school and I would write stuff, within that. But a lot of that was working with actors and having them, improvise stuff. That was big for me. Um, like I did a we did a completely a show that was like in high school. I directed a show that was completely developed out of like a long series of like workshopped improvisations, and I did the same thing in college too. We did a soap opera that was improvised, or it came out of improvisations, called House of Corn. Um, and it was funny, like it was interesting to me because what people thought theater was pretty boring to me. There was the idea of standing on a platform at one end of a room and pretending to be someone else wasn't super convincing to me as like as something to do. I really thought it was the stuff I did was really aggressively experimental, but it was also really it kept coming out as funny. And I really embraced that. You know the House of Corn show we did in university, the drama department hated it. They just thought it was just beneath them. And I think there were 4 or 6 episodes, but it was about like a farming family fighting over the family dynasty. But I mean, we put in like gore and elaborate stage combat and sex scenes and just wanton drug use. And I mean, it was really over the top and sort of like very grand guignol. And the first one I remember was, I think maybe 20 people came, 30 people came. By the time we got to the finale, we had, I mean, it was a school. I went to Bennington for a year, and it was a school of about 460 students. And I think we had 200 to 300 people at that final show. And we did it site specific. So we had it all over this arts building they had. So we had this like mob of people like trooping through this building from one chunk of the show to another. It was fun, but it was very much like it was aggressively lowbrow what I did.
And just to clarify, so I'm like kind of getting, first of all, that sounds fascinating. And just so I'm kind of getting the visuals together is basically when you say episodes, it was like there's a series of performances that people are kind of like attending to continue
Yeah,
the
I
story
mean
and continue the narrative.
it was a soap opera. So it was like each episode would develop like what happens next. And then we do rehearsals, which were improvised, and then sort of improvised within the scenes. There'd be stuff that just killed that we'd obviously keep in verbatim, but a lot of dialogue was improvised and stuff.
Oh, that's really funny. And I didn't know you went to Bennington. So you started off in Vermont and then eventually made your way to NYU?
Yeah, within a year, I pretty quickly realized Bennington wasn't for me. It was really small. It was really isolated. The social scene was really like a demolition derby. It was, someone described it at the time, and I don't think they're wrong, is like 460 kids with too much money driving each other crazy on top of a mountain. And it just wasn't for me. And so much about college and the education you get is where you go rather than what you do or study, unless you're doing something, especially as an undergrad. And coming to New York was huge for me.
What was like, as somebody who had, grown up in South Carolina and then made his way to Vermont, like what was the sort of like aura and intrigue of New York that you were like really hoping to tap into?
Oh, it was very much. the theater scene and the club scene. It was just, or it was the theater scene, and then I rapidly realized that was the club scene at the time because I got here in sort of the early club kids era when drag queens were going big and costumes and looks and personas were getting big and really over the top and exaggerated. Um, there was a big sort of there was a big element of sort of horror and exploitation movie in all of it. A lot of influence from horror films, and you had groups like Black Lips and Blue Lips and the voluptuous horror of Karen Black and all this. That were really just sort of, and the tail end, the ridiculous theater, and Mimi Gacy, who had a huge impact on me, who was a performance artist who's a bit forgotten these days, but her and David Kale are two people who really changed what I thought. David would do these shows that were just he would have a band, but it was like some spoken, some sung, and it was just him telling story after story. And then Mimi Gacy was a one woman performer, but her thing was very horror oriented. I mean, her teeth would be painted black. She would do like insertions of long skewers under her skin and stuff. It was really, Diamanda Gallet was around. It was just really, really eye opening. And I never felt intimidated by New York. I was excited. Like I've been reading about this stuff for years as a kid in libraries, and I wanted to get here, man. I wanted to jump in.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to know. Like, so in college, I think there's just like this point at which you're like learning about yourself, and you also have this like added confidence that like nobody knows you. So now you can kind of reinvent and like completely invigorate yourself into whatever your new personality or excitement's going to be. Seeing all these different sort of performance artists and knowing that like you're in the capital of theater, like how did you want to implement yourself into the New York scene?
Oh, I wanted to keep doing what I was doing, and here was room to do it. The stuff I liked was really lowbrow. It was really vulgar. It was really, I wanted to be doing shows in bars, and I also really loved like extreme experimental stuff, like Robert Wilson or the Wooster Group, and I kept trying to bridge that. And it's funny, a theater company I hooked up with, who I still work with some. Um, when I joined them, they came out of the Pyramid Club down on the Lower East or the East Village, and that sort of 80s performance art scene. And it was a lot of queer performers, a lot of drag performers. And they were really doing very avant-garde, very experimental stuff. I mean, when I joined, and probably I think within the first year of doing stuff with them, the director of the company, Kevin Maloney, who's a really good friend of mine, he said, "We're done. We're out. We're done. We're over. We're not doing this stuff anymore. We're doing comedy from now on." And he was just, this was sort of right before you had stuff like AZT therapy for AIDS, and his long-term boyfriend was HIV positive and dying, and he was like, it's too much. There's too much pain out there. We're doing comedies, and we did for years after that, and just ridiculous, extravagant stuff. And it was so fun and so liberating and so raunchy and offensive and great. It was a real blast.
Interesting. And there's like that just wonderful connection between sort of horror and theater that like always comes up. Uh
Right.
which I think is interesting. This is a super niche question that listeners are going to be like, who is he talking about? But I'm just very curious. Did you run into the theater of Richard Foreman at all while you were in New
Oh
York?
yeah, yeah,
Okay.
sure. I always saw a couple of Richard Foreman's pieces. God, what was his theater company called? I cannot remember what they were called, but yeah, I definitely saw a few pieces by them. The thing with some of the people, and I rapidly realized this, and I think it took me a while to sort of process it. I really, I was really enthralled by really avant-garde, very formalist theater companies like Richard Foreman and the Wooster Group and things like that. But then actually sitting through their shows, I was like, this isn't as much fun to sit through as I thought. And I'm too much of I think too much about the audience. And so I was like, I can't do that to people, you know?
Yeah. So
I
he
tried. Yeah. What
no,
were you gonna
sorry.
say?
I was just gonna say the ontological hysteric theater was
Ontological hysteric theater. Yes, thank you.
was his, and just for listeners who are like wondering where I'm pulling this out of, my MFA is in documentary filmmaking, but my undergrad is in experimental filmmaking, and
Ah,
he did a film thing where he like moved around, and I was a sound designer for one of his projects, and I've never had the pleasure of seeing any of his performances, but the constant thing that I've heard is very similar to what you're saying, Grady, which is like he does this stuff that like is fascinating and really interesting, oftentimes more to read about or to like
yes.
think about the theories than the actual like audience participation or lack thereof component.
Yeah. Well, and it's also one of those things, it really made me working with Tweed, which was Kevin's company, it really made me realize that what matters is the audience ultimately, like the butts in seats. And an audience can admire you and come to your things. An audience can get intellectual satisfaction from what you do and come because of that. But those aren't hot reasons. Those are very cold reasons. They're very that you want to grab people in an emotional way so that they feel like they have to be at the next show. That what they saw at the last one was so they can't believe it. And they gotta come. I mean, we did a version of uh The Postman Always Rings Twice because we did a lot of sort of parodies. We keep the text the same, but just really wreck the show with Tweed. And we had a gag in one of the shows because there's a famous sex scene in the movie where it starts as a sex scene and quite literally it was just a very simple cutaway gag, but um, the guy playing the John Garfield role just vanishes into her vagina. And people could not believe it. They did not understand. It was just a really simple cutaway on the furniture, but they could not believe it. And we had people who came back more than once because that one thing just blew their minds. And so I realized that like really grabbing an audience and not letting them go and making them feel like it is essential that they be there is so important because that's how they'll show up and it's more fun. You would be in these rooms and just have this energy to these performances that you weren't getting at some other places. It felt much more communal and it felt very rowdy in all the best ways.
And there's something to be said about going to extremes and then finding your center later.
Yeah, exactly. And also, one of the things is like playing it safe just never works. I don't know what that is. Like, I don't have enough control over my writing to play it safe because that assumes that you know what unsafe is, like that you somehow calibrate very carefully what you're doing. And I'm not that good. I'm not that technically polished. I sort of have to I take big swings, because I want to make an impact, as a writer. And that's really when I worked with Tweed for a long time. I did a lot of other stuff. It was funny. I was just seeing a very sober panel discussion in what had used to be this really wild performance venue. And I was like, I was on that same stage as these panelists dressed in a red jock strap, crawling out with 8 other basically naked boys from under the giant hoop skirt of this drag queen, Varla Jean Merman, and then hosing her down with fake blood that we had in these giant horse syringes. I was like, this is weird to be back here, 25 years later, in a much more I think they were talking about the economy or something. Uh, but
Fascinating.
yeah, but one of and the real reason I sort of shifted, even though I kept working with Tweed, but the real reason I shifted my interests from theater to writing is I was developing all these shows and working on them and writing with people and doing things. But I realized that with theater and even with filmmaking, a lot of your job was getting people to show up on time and learn their lines. And I just realized, how many people can I take out of this this formula so that it's reliable? And ultimately I realized it was me. Like it was kind of down to me basically.
Yeah, and it's like it's reviewing your resources and then figuring out how you can make the most amount of stuff with the resources you have, and oftentimes it's
Yeah,
within yourself that you can kind of move forward. Just a couple little things. One is for
yeah.
anybody who's also interested in the sort of like connection between horror and theater. Stuart Gordon, the director of
Oh yeah,
Reanimator, also did a ton of really cool avant-garde theater stuff, and Nick Taylor does a great interview with him, kind of talking about like, all right, the audience is in there, lock the doors. Like
yeah,
doing performances where nobody could leave. I want to get to your writing process, but I have one other sort of
yeah, yeah.
particular question, which is I've heard you talk a lot about the fact that you lived in Los Angeles for a little while. I think you and your wife were both extras in Scream 2 or Scream 3.
Yes,
Scream,
yes.
yeah. Uh,
Scream 2.
Scream 2, thank you. And you have your wife has an interesting interaction with Jada Pinkett Smith, if I recall.
Yeah.
And then you ended up living in Hong Kong for a little while. And I was kind of curious about what ended up bringing you there.
Well, so my wife and I lived up the street in University from what wound up being the last Chinatown movie theater in North America, the Music Palace on Hester and Bowery. And it was great. We went there because it was cheap. It was like $6 for a double feature. And you could smoke in there and eat and drink and whatever, and it was really fabulously dilapidated, and it was all brand new to us, and we just went for years and really fell in love with Hong Kong movies. And when we graduated from university, we kind of didn't know what we were going to do with ourselves. And I bumped into a friend of mine, Dan, who his family was originally from Hong Kong, and he's like, "Oh yeah, I'm moving back there." And I came home, and I was like, "Dan's moving. He says it's easy. We should go." So I never saw Dan again, but we moved and got jobs. I sold cleaning chemicals like industrial cleaning chemicals. She worked for AIG, the insurance company, and like we lived there for a little over a year. And it was great. It was Hong Kong was really at its best. This was 95, 96, and we left, I think, January of 97. And it was a really arts forward city. It was a going out city. It was a socially, the food was amazing. I mean, I think it really changed my wife's life. She's a chef in terms of cooking. It really changed my life just in terms of not living in America for a little bit and just sort of getting a different perspective on the world. And then when we came back and I started getting into freelance writing, I was able to sort of speak to Asian film was getting big here. And I was able to sort of speak to that in a way a lot of writers weren't because I'd been on the ground and I knew people. I look back at my early writing I did for fan magazines and stuff, and it was terrible. But having been in Hong Kong and then meeting a lot of people online who were really well versed, this was the early days of like bulletin boards and forums and things. It was really huge for me.
So when you talk about the idea that like Asian cinema is sort of making its way to America, I just reviewed Iron Fists and Kung Fu Kicks, the documentary
Oh
that
yeah, yeah,
you wrote,
yeah,
and
yeah.
you guys talk about it's just something I hadn't really thought about, the idea that like so the Matrix, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, that sort of era of filmmaking is when like all of a sudden they're figuring out a way to really sort of modern westernize it. Is that the sort of era that you were stepping into where you're kind of
Yeah,
communicating?
yeah. I mean, soon after I came back to the States was when John Woo came to the States and made Hard Target with Jean-Claude Van Damme. And you had more and more people advocating for Hong Kong movies in the States. I mean, on a small level, you had people like Barry Long, who was a clerk at Kim's Video in New York, who was just a huge advocate. I mean, he would just put them in people's hands. I mean, he taught me a huge amount. He's passed away now. And on the high end, you had people like Quentin Tarantino, who were speaking out, about Hong Kong movies and things. And so you had, in rapid succession, you had John Woo come over, you had Jackie Chan come over with Rumble in the Bronx, you had Michelle Yeoh come over, you had Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. I mean, it was just a huge wave through the late 90s into the early 2000s.
And how did you fit into that puzzle? Like how did you
Uh,
monetize that?
yeah. So basically, I had sort of two things I could do. One is I knew the stuff on the ground, so I knew what was hype and what wasn't. Because there was stuff that was really this idea that oh, these these guys are finally getting their big break. And I was able to say, well, no, Jackie Chan actually came over here before in the 80s. We just universally rejected him. And no, these movies actually do play in America all over the place. I mean, there's a circuit of Chinatown movie theaters in the country, or there was at the time. And the other thing I was able to do is you would meet people online. You would meet people at screenings. I was screening a lot of films. I worked with some guys in a group called Subway Cinema that started doing film festivals just based on our love. And when the Music Palace closed, we just sort of started screening the movies. And so people would want you to write things. They'd realize you had some knowledge. So, I was freelance writing. And more than that, though, what really, helped me is it was the early days of internet journalism. And so people were experimenting with blogs. So I did a blog called Kaiju Shakedown for Variety. That for a while I did it for years, but it was the most read piece of Variety for about, I don't know, a 6 or 7 month period. But it was huge for them in terms of traffic. And I was able to do it, the really simple lessons that people didn't seem to know early on in the internet journalism age. You make it really voicey. You post an update regularly. You correct when you're wrong. You reach out to people and do your research. And it was just really, they just weren't doing that. They were too old school journalists, and I didn't have anything to lose. And then that got sort of kicked off the regular Variety site when Variety started an Asian Variety, and it went over to there where it ran for a very long time, really successfully. Made a lot of money for them, and then eventually they just closed it all down. They lost interest in Asia.
Fascinating. So what you're doing, so thank you for shedding some light on that, because I've always heard like Grady did freelance journalism, but I've always been
Right.
curious about sort of what that is. What other sort of freelance gigs were you picking up? Because I know eventually you ended up getting into screenwriting.
Yeah. So basically, I was doing a lot of Asian film industry coverage, and I was doing stuff like I was working in the Hong Kong film industry. I was working on this big award show they did every year. I'd go to Hong Kong for like usually 3 to 6 weeks every year to work on that. It was a big live TV thing like the Oscars. Um, and but I started getting hired for other freelance gigs. Film Comment was hiring me to write about stuff. And then places like the Village Voice and the New York Sun and people on Slate, people were always open to pitches. It was a really go-go era for that kind of journalism and that kind of cultural coverage. And so I was pitching everyone everything I could. I had done a documentary with some friends from high school about the Confederate flag because it still flew over the South Carolina State House. So I was able to like roll over into some like cultural coverage of the South. I knew comic books pretty well, so I was able to do comic book reviews and write ups and things. But really was film coverage, and I wound up being the lowest man on the totem pole for the New York Sun, which was Jared Kushner of all people's attempt to make a sort of like a flip to the Wall Street Journal, basically. And so it was a very right wing paper, but the cultural section, which they spent a lot of money on, was super pinko. Like we were a bunch of like lefties writing for it. So you'd have like a marquee name right wing film reviewer who'd file like a piece a week, and then you had like four of us who were reviewing everything. And it's funny to look around New York now and see how few movie theaters there are and how cautious the programming has gotten compared to the 2000s when it just felt like, oh my God, there was something, there was a theater that just dedicated itself for a year to only playing regional movies from like the tri-state area. And so it was movies you never even heard of, and a lot of horror. And so you were just seeing great stuff. I mean, really wild movies, but very things that would never play nationally.
Interesting.
And then
I'm
in 2008, with the economy crashing, basically every newspaper and magazine cut their freelancer budgets. And so they just made their staff writers work harder.
And you being the person who just can't say no to education ends up going to the University of California at San Diego to do the Clarion Writers Workshop, right?
Yeah. I mean, I was at a point where it was like, what can I do? I can file copy, I can write fast. I fooled around a little with writing fiction because I wanted to, but I didn't know how or what or why. And so I realized I had to get serious about it. And I went to Clarion, and Clarion really did I mean, in 6 weeks, it radically changed my life. It just, it made me step up my game. It made me take writing seriously, and not in that kind of like, there's a way, if you're a freelance writer, especially if you do like journalism or cultural coverage or something, you kind of sneer at your own dreams. You kind of like don't take what you do. Oh yeah, I'm working on a novel, or oh yeah, I write fiction. You really kind of look down on it because you're preemptively, protecting yourself from any, criticism, or if it's bad, or if it never works for you. And I realized that that was just a waste of time and energy. Like I was either going to take it seriously and do it or not. And they had a different teacher come for a week. So like Paula Park, Liz Hand, Kim Stanley Robinson, Bob Cray, Larissa Lai, and Holly Black. And Holly was our first week's teacher. And what really changed things for me is she gave us all this sort of out of class assignment to just write a quick short story. And I wrote a really long short story and gave it to her. And you had sort of a one-on-one session with the teachers. And Holly was like, if you're willing to do the work, you can do this. Like you can do this if you're willing to put in the work. And I was
As
like,
it,
okay,
a-
I've always been a hard worker. So
as in said that to you directly. Like this was
yeah,
like the Grady, I'm holding your head in my hands. Like this is possible.
yeah, yeah. And she didn't say it as some kind of grand revelation, but was just like, you're good at this. And if you've got a knack, and if you're willing to do the work, you can do this. It's I've never been scared of work. So I was like, all right. I've never been particularly good at many things. So, but I've always been willing to work really hard at them.
Yeah, so I guess my question is I'm unfamiliar with the Clarion Writers Workshop, but I'm curious about like when Holly's talking to you and is like, hey, this is something that you should really consider. Was there a specific medium or a specific like mode of communication that she was trying to encourage you to head into? Because I always think about you
Oh,
as like a master of like comics and screenplays and novels and nonfiction books. So I wasn't sure like if there was a direction that like, hey, head this way.
no, it because Clarion really focuses on short stories, because the whole point of it is write a lot and read a lot and critique a lot. And so every week you'd have to write a new short story. The class of 24 to 26, I can't remember how many it was. Everyone reads everyone's story, and then you go around a circle. You critique the person's story, and it's not an argument. I mean, you sit there and you listen to the critique of your story, and it could get pretty brutal, not in a personal way, but you know you would be trying something and taking some swings, and sometimes it just does not work, or you'd have done something and not realized it, and you'd be called out for that. And so it was really, we're all talking short stories. That was really everything that was being talked about, which is funny because I'm very bad at short stories. I
You
find
don't
them very difficult.
You like Ankle Snatcher, right?
Yeah.
Which was great. Everybody should read that story. It's on Amazon.
Oh, thanks.
Um, really cool. So you're doing that. Were you, eventually I know you worked with Katie Crouch to kind of help her
Mhm.
write another YA novel and stuff, but were you doing the screenplay thing before the novel thing?
Oh, yeah, I was trying to write screenplays. I mean, I wrote so many screenplays that will never see the light of day. I tried to write a Jean-Claude Van Damme movie. I tried everything. I I was really heavily influenced by Hong Kong film, which I think was something I needed to get out of my system, and was to my detriment to some extent. But I mean, I wrote this screenplay that I love. I wrote a time traveling screenplay. I wrote a screenplay about basically a war between two, like a gang of roving children's birthday party magicians who are also lawyers, who stumble into a war between two rival novelty good manufacturers, one of which has been taken over by aliens. And it was using magic and kung fu, but the magic was all legal. So it was like, habeas corpus and, things like that. It was so ridiculous. But yeah, I mean, it was fun. They just didn't go anywhere. But I'd send them out to people. I'd send them to production companies. I'd send them to contests. I did all that stuff.
And I read somewhere that you we're talking about something writing something like 12 to 13 full screenplays before kind of even figuring out how to monetize it.
Oh yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, I wrote one, two, three, probably five novels, start to finish. Before, Satan Loves You is one that I self-published. A novella I did, Bad Astronauts, which is really called originally called Occupy Space. But there were three other books that were novels that I tried to, but that just never took off. They never impressed anyone. They got trunked.
Interesting. It's I was looking up Satan Loves You yesterday to figure out like, oh, like can you still get this book? And I was like, oh, you can for $400 on
Oh,
Amazon.
yeah. Well, I took it off the market because I really wanted to do a rewrite on it to just sort of update it a little bit. And it's just fallen way down on my to-do list, unfortunately.
Rumor is you are a busy guy, Grady.
Time management is difficult.
Well, so let's talk about this. So you were involved with a bunch of different publications. So as I mentioned, The White Glove War in 2012 with Katie Crouch. You self-published Satan Loves You in 2012 as well. You also work on a cookbook, graphic novel, memoir with your wife Amanda Cohen for the Dirt Candy Cookbook, and a Little Women comic adaptation, which is
Oh yeah.
adorable, by the way.
Oh,
Um,
thanks.
and then eventually, and please correct me if I'm wrong in this, but it seems like the first thing that really kind of gets its claws in is horror store in regards to
Yeah.
being something that's like heavily marketed. And for people who are kind of unfamiliar with horror store, we're talking about a book that is a horror book, basically that looks like an IKEA catalog, and it's all about the sort of like stuff going on behind the scenes at IKEA.
Yeah.
How do you pitch that? Because it's one of those things where oftentimes you see the sort of first book that somebody comes out with and the graphic design struggling or they don't know how to get it in the right hands or whatever. But like that is one piece of media that when I hold it in my hands and I just look at it, it's like it's so beautifully thought through and so beautifully collaborated that it seems like it was just like birthed perfection.
Yeah. So that was not anything you just said. That was basically what happened was a friend of mine's girlfriend, now wife, who I'd gone to Clarion with, Matt London. He does narrative writing for games these days, and his wife Jordan, she was an editor of children's books. And she was looking for a different position. She's become an agent now and is a really good one. But she was looking for a different position and she interviewed with Quirk Books down in Philly. And during the interview, Jason Rekulik, who was the head editor there, it was a very small label, imprint, or publisher, I guess. He said, what are some writers that you've been looking at who you would bring over? And she named me. And so she didn't get the job, but Jason dropped me an email and was like, hey, do you have anything I could read? And so I sent him a book I had trunked called McMansions of the Damned. And he really hated it, but he really liked my writing style. And so we started talking about, and he liked the fact that it was sort of an attempt to do something new with a haunted house book. And we were talking about it, and we were talking about how big box stores would be haunted. And we were sort of kicking that around a little. And he's like, oh, an IKEA. And he had the idea to do it to the trim side, but that's all we had is a horror store, IKEA, and he really wanted to make sure it was the trim size of an IKEA catalog because IKEA was just coming to the States at that point. And the cover looked like an IKEA catalog. And so then so I pitched him one version of it. He didn't like it. I pitched him another version of it that he liked. And then it was really writing and rewriting and figuring that out. And it's funny, the book really happened organically. Because it was a smaller publisher, we had a lot more leeway to do stuff. Like Jason didn't have to run anything by a bunch of approvals. And so Andy Reid, who is the art director on that, I would be like, Andy, could we do like, or she would be like, oh, let me do a piece of furniture at the top of every chapter. And I'd be like, well, let me do a catalog entry for it too. And Jason would be like, what if they got darker as it went? And oh, hey, can we have a map? I drew a map, like, and all the stuff, every bit of text in there I wrote because I've written catalog copy like that before as a freelancer. And so it just really evolved organically, and really it went from let's do something fun with a haunted house book to let's do something fun with a haunted IKEA book to what it wound up being. But it was very much, I mean, it had a lot of chefs in there. And in fact, Orsk was called IKEA up until the last minute when the president of the big guy in charge of Cork was like, we can't go out with a book with IKEA. I'm just worried about liability. And so all the Orsk branding and everything came up very late in the process.
That's really interesting. So, as I mentioned earlier in this interview, I am fascinated by your research process, and just for listeners out there who may not be familiar with the insanity that is Grady Hendrix, like when I met you a couple years ago, we were talking about your book Paperbacks from Hell, which looks at all these amazing horror paperbacks from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and you will just read one a day or two a day, and like consume so much content and then find a way to filter it into an accessible way for readers. Like, how did you tackle if we're going to stay with horror store, like, how did you tackle the research angle to ensure that like you're hitting all the elements of this sort of IKEA narrative, while also fitting it in with your sort of like horror expectations?
Yeah, so I my in-laws had a condo down in Florida and it was near an IKEA. So I went down there for about a week. And for a week I just went to the IKEA every day. And I'd be there usually 4 to 8 hours every day, just sort of taking in the vibe. And then I interviewed about a dozen people, either former or current employees for IKEA, just how it worked and all that stuff. I read everything I could about IKEA, like every article I could find, I read. And I really just immersed myself in it. And I read a lot about retail and retail psychology and all this stuff, and really just tried to figure out what is this. And it's funny, I had worked for about 5 years as as basically the receptionist, the office manager, answering the phones for a parapsychological research nonprofit. And when I first tried to write horror story, I was like, oh, I'm going to use all this stuff I know about quote unquote real hauntings to like really make this different. And I rapidly realized, like Jason disabused me of that pretty quickly because he's like, this is a bit boring. Because real hauntings are quite boring. They're very profound experiences for the people going through them. But it's like someone walked through a room, someone says your name. Like that's not going to pack the seats. That's not going to make the book fly off the shelves. People want walls dripping blood and swarms of flies and get out. And so I really realized that all that realism I wanted to bring to it was, let me go for broke here in terms of like good old fashioned haunted houses and try to reinterpret those tropes in a retail direction. But like when I did Witchcraft for Wayward Girls, I mean, it's set in St. Augustine. So I went to St. Augustine for a week and lived down there. I went to the historical society every day for hours reading every newspaper, the local newspaper I could for the months that this took place, just to know what was going on in the weather. I've got a wall full of calendars for the dates that this happened and what's going on every day, and maps and rooms mapped out. And, I've got a ton of books on maternity homes and unwed mothers and obstetrics and witchcraft and all that stuff. And I really reached out to a lot of moms for their birth stories, a lot of OBs, a lot of laborists, a lot of midwives, and just trying to wrap my head around this. It's a messy, sloppy process. I mean, this is a witch book, and I wrote two drafts of it that didn't have any witches in it. I thought it was going to be like a folk horror book, and that just sort of, my editor now, Jess Wade, was just like, well, I don't think this is coming together. And so, yeah.
Oftentimes when we like, when I talk to authors or when we hear stories about authors, there's like this, hey, there's this story that I really have to get out of me, and then eventually they write it, it exists, it goes through some minor editing, and then eventually it finds a publisher. At least that's sort of like the
Mhm.
ideal scenario. But you seem to come at it from a very different direction, which is like either, hey, here's the pitch of an idea I have, oh, you don't like it, it's okay, we can kill that darling and move forward, or kind of work with whoever your editor is to find that sort of right narrative. Um,
Mhm.
I guess my question is like, at what point, as you're doing all this sort of research to sort of hone in the story, and as you just mentioned, like writing a witch book that doesn't have any witches in it, like how do you get to that point where enough is enough and it's time to just put it all in the story or synthesize what needs to go in the story?
I mean, never. It's kind of like one of those things that just keeps happening. So what you're saying, I agree with. For me, I really so every book I write has some technical challenge in it for myself that I want to see if I can accomplish. But every book I write also has something in there that's like a question I can't answer, something I revolve around, and that sort of what becomes the engine of the book. Um, Finding a way to write about that, and like with witchcraft, it's definitely I have two relatives who are older; they're both passed away now, but who were sent away when they were teenagers and got pregnant. And I've never been able to wrap my head around that. I just the cruelty of it, the how we thought that was a system that worked, how you live the rest of your life and maybe never know if your child that you had is alive or dead. I mean, all of that is just so hard for me to wrestle with. And so I really wanted to write this book for a while. But then figuring out how it works, I really thought it was going to be a folk horror book about, folk horrors about fertility and all that stuff. And at a certain point, my editor, Jess, was like, I do a show instead of a traditional book event, and it's a 1 hour presentation. There's slides, there's sometimes songs where it's really about like the one I did for Paperbacks from Hell is sort of a live version of that book, the history of the paperback boom. The one I did for Final Girl Support Group is really a history live of sort of murder books and serial killer movies. And so Jess asked me, she's like, well, what's the show going to be about? And I was like, well, witches. And I was like, and she's like, well, don't you think the book needs to be about witches then? And I was like, oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're right. But I couldn't see that. Um, and so for me, it's really about the stuff coming together and clicking into place. And often that happens as you go. Um,
Well, let me
More so than, yeah,
No, I was just gonna say, I know we're coming to the end of our time together, and I guess if we could just do one other quick case study. I'm really
yeah,
curious about my best friend's Exorcism you wrote in 2016, and like if we can use that as a case study. One is I know that you supposedly sold the name of the book before you had the
yeah,
book planned, but I'm curious about
yeah.
like for that one, if we're thinking about a story about two high school girls, one is possessed, and the power of friendship is the thing that can save this person from this demon. What was the sort of technical challenge for that, and what was the sort of question you were grappling with?
Yeah. Okay. So, and one thing I will say also is, I really, really believe because you had said before, how do you know when a book's ready or done? I don't like, I really believe that, I should use every minute up to they pry it out of my fingers to make it better. It's the same way like a filmmaker will just, go into the editing room and like, nope, it's not working. We need to dub in new dialogue here. We need to reshoot this. We need to re-edit that. Like I will keep pulling it apart and building it better and making improvements until a point of diminishing returns. I just feel like it's not never done. Um, so anyways, but so my best friend's exorcism. So basically what happened was Horror Store did well. And Jason was like, look, I'd done a 1 book deal. And he's like, look, we want to sign you up for like a 2 book deal. And I was like, great. And he came to New York and we had dinner. And he was asking what I was thinking about writing it, and I was just pitching him idea after idea. And I mean, some of those ideas would go on to be Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires and Final Girl Support Group, and but it was like it just was getting nowhere. We Sold Our Souls was one of those ideas, and he just wasn't. And finally, I just threw this Hail Mary, and I was like, I got a title, but no book. But my best friend's Exorcism, and he's like, I love it. Can you get me a proposal? And so I got him a proposal for it, and he was okay with it. And but we signed a contract, and then I wrote a much more extensive treatment, and he was like, "Yeah, okay, this is fine." And then I wrote a draft of it, and really banged my head against it. And he was like, this is a no-go. I don't think this is working. Like, you're a dude, you're writing about high school girls. I just don't think it's working. And my wife read it and basically said the exact same thing. And I had like a 70,000 word draft, I think. And I thought it was really good. And my wife was like, this just, and Jason was right. But that really helpful comment came from my wife, who was like, this just feels like stuff you stole from John Hughes movies. And I realized I had really just, rather than figure out what my experience of high school in the 80s was like, I just magpied together other people's and things I'd saw in pop culture depictions of it, like Mean Girls and Breakfast Club and all that, and stuff that really spoke to me. But like, I was stealing, and it was fake. And so I sat down for about 2 weeks and like went through all my old letters from high school, my wife's like diaries, my diaries, photos, everything. I would recopy letters to like, what's the feel of writing these sentences? And I finally started to really remember what it had been like. And and from there it was okay. And it was a much simpler story than I had. I had like two timelines that were moving in parallel and all this stuff with bugs and like and dads and exorcists like in cults and communes and on compounds. And the story just got simpler and simpler. And it really taught me that, and then I learned this from screenwriting, but that every book I write has to have a log line that I can boil down to like a sentence. And this one, it was like, it's about two girls whose friendship is powerful enough to beat Satan. And everything that, because writing a book takes a long time. There's a lot of words. You do a lot of writing. And so to me, that's the compass that keeps me navigated when I get dark, that log line. And if it's about that sentence, great. If it's not, throw it out. It doesn't have any place here. And so that's sort of how it came together. And I actually wrote another draft of it that stuck, was clinging to that timeline. And um, that was another moment where I was like, this isn't going to work. And then I just threw out the timeline. And I was like, this book, everyone was much happier with it. And I think I turned in like a 2/3 draft, because that was the moment where people were like, this really isn't coming together. We've spent even more time on this and it's not working. And I was like, I threw everything out that was like the modern day stuff. And I was like, this may be a book y'all want to sell, but this will be a stupider book, a less accomplished book, a less interesting book. I think readers won't like it. And I was wrong. I was completely wrong. And what I realized is that people really want to read about a character and they really want to know. You see this a lot. It's something you see a lot in I've written a lot about like action films and action choreography, and you see it a lot in horror movies too, which is like, it's not how hard the blow is on screen. What counts just as much is the stunt work of the person taking the blow and reacting to it, and falling, through a table or whatever. And it's the same in horror movies, that what really sells a scare is not, oh my God, it's the most goopy special effect ever. It's cutting to a character reacting to that goopy special effect. And in books, what I really realized was people want to know, people want to be invested in that main character and they want to know what this is doing to them. They want to know what's going on in them. Um, you know, it's not enough that Gretchen is turning into a scab-faced, possessed demoniac. They want to know how that feels for Abby and who's witnessing it. And so like that was huge for me. And the technical challenge really with my best friend's exorcism was can I do this? Can I write from the point of view of two girls in 10th grade? But I was very lucky with my best friend's exorcism. And the same thing happened again with Final Girl Support Group, where the entire book is in the title. Like everything I need for that book is in the title. What replaces faith in this? Friendship. When's friendship stronger? High school. Who is friendship in high school? Who has the most demonstrative and dramatic friendships in high schools? Girls. What high school am I going to write about? I can't write about modern day high school with active shooter drills and vaping and cell phones. I have to write about my high school. That's 1988. So it's going to be set then. So that was really, everything I needed was right there.
Awesome. That was amazing. Thank you so much. I got three rapid fire questions for you to
Yeah, yeah, of
wrap this
course.
thing up if you're ready, Grady. Uh,
Yeah.
the first one is that for somebody who writes horror stuff all the time and consumes horror stuff all the time, from what I understand, your nickname is Sunshine.
Yeah. Yes, growing up, that was my nickname. No one's quite sure why. I think it was because I had red hair, but in my family, that's pretty much still what I'm called.
I love it. Is it's still like used as an endearing term for you?
Oh yeah, yeah, or to annoy me.
All right. Next time I get a book signed by you, I expect sunshine. Number two is, I always want to make space at the end of the show for just anything maybe we haven't covered. Is there anything on your mind or anything that we haven't really tackled that you want to throw out there?
Yeah, I mean, Witchcraft for Wayward Girls is coming out on January 14th of this coming year. And I also do a podcast like a lot of people. I'm very slow at it because I don't know, did you know this? Podcasts are hard. Um, who knew? But I've been doing it about vampires and the history of vampires and it's called Super Scary Haunted Homeschool. It's on Spotify and everything. But really, the easiest way to find it, if you're looking for it, is just my website, which is where everything is, including my upcoming tour schedule for the Witchcraft book, gradyhendrix.com. But Super Scary Haunted Homeschool I spend way too much money and way too much time on it, but I love doing it. And I finally am wrapping up with the whole vampire season, which has taken me years to do, with a Twilight episode that actually my producer is editing right now.
And I will, my podcast is obviously wonderful, but I will just state that I just listened to the Hopping Vampires episode yesterday of
Ah,
Super Scary Haunted Homeschool, and it's academia at a level that is higher than anybody would ever expect to cover vampires. It's fascinating. So
well, thank you. And also, it's funny. I just decided to go for broke about 5 episodes ago, and so we have like actors in it now, musicians. Like we pay for the whole shebang.
I love it. Well, and my last question for you, Grady, just
Yeah,
real quick, because I think it's really interesting, is that oftentimes in the writing world, people very much view writing as this sort of reclusive, uh, you know, I don't know, passion and job. And then that's what they do all the time. And in interviews, one of the things that I always find appealing and I always really appreciate about you and the way you operate is that your love of people and your love of being around people becomes such an important part of your process. And I was just curious about like, how do you make sure that you schedule your time to have those moments? Because you're always doing stuff, man. Like,
yeah.
how do you get the people in your life?
Yeah, it's really hard. I mean, one reason I like doing research is it gives me an excuse to interview people, but it's really hard. I mean, Witchcraft was supposed to be done in March and it took me until August and it was really down to the wire. And I honestly there's friends I haven't seen in months. There's babies that have been born, birthday parties I missed, people's movies I know who've premiered. I've missed it, and it's been really rough. And right now it's spooky season. It's just the end of it. And so I just am coming off a stint on the road. November, December, until I go on book tour in January, I'm really just trying to get some writing done. But it's really rough because as much as I like going on the road and meeting readers, I love this stuff. I really, at the end of the day, you got to close the door and write. And actually, someone who I find enormously inspirational for this is Stephen Graham Jones. Like, Stephen writes everywhere. He writes on planes. He writes while you're talking to him. He writes during movies. I've seen him actually jot down notes for a short story while he was on a panel being interviewed. And it's one of those things where I'm very precious sometimes about like, I need quiet. I need to be left alone. Um, Steven just does it, and that's been really educational for me to watch.
Awesome. Well, Grady, this has been an absolute pleasure. Thanks so much for making space for conversation and coming on the Meditations podcast.
Oh, dude, thanks for having me.
Grady Hendrix rules. It's just a fact. What a charming Southern gentleman with a terrible, terrifying, research driven, obsessive mind. I just can't get over the sheer number of drafts that he writes for every single project. It is baffling to me. But That's why he's good at what he does. Constant revision, constant research. I think I'm going to, I don't know, tattoo that to my forehead or something. Grady, thank you so much for coming on the show. And for listeners at home, if you're looking for some new Grady Hendrix in your life, I strongly encourage you to be on the lookout for Witchcraft For Wayward Girls, which is dropping in just a few weeks. And then also he's releasing a new edition of These Fists Break Bricks, which is his nonfiction book all about Kung Fu cinema. Both of those things will be dropping in 2024. And the other thing that's going to be happening in just a few weeks is he's going to be doing his book tour. And as referenced in the interview, his book tours are not somebody just reading excerpts from a book, seeing how many people fall asleep. These are true performances that will make you laugh and give you insight into his research practices. And I know for a fact that there is at least one that is available online. So if you're interested in those things, go to gradyhendrix.com and check it out. The next episode is dropping on none other than New Year's Day. And in the spirit of starting fresh and thinking about what we want out of 2025, we're doing a dry January episode with Chris Clemens. Chris is the Instagram handle Non-Rockaholic. He's an activist for non-alcoholic beverage options at bars and wineries across the country. He's a recovering addict and is somebody who is very upfront about his story and the way in which he rechanneled his addiction into such cool projects as Non-Rockaholic and his just wonderful blog Exploring Upstate. So if you're interested in kind of thinking about new ways to reset yourself for 2025, tune in on January 1st to the Meditations podcast. You might be surprised at what cool stuff you learned from Chris. As always, if you like what you're hearing, please go and like and subscribe to the show, or most importantly, give yourself a chance to learn something new with past episodes. If you want to stay in the writing space, last episode, on episode 36, I had the privilege of talking with author Gregory Maguire, the writer of Wicked. I also talked with Jen Gunnels in episode 32, who is an editor for Tor Publishing. On episode 27, Soma Mae Shung Fraser came on the show to talk about her latest novel, Off the Books. Dean Haspiel joined me on episode 24 to talk about his career in playwriting and cartooning. And then the one that's most near and dear to my heart is on episode 21. Tim Jacobus came on the show, the illustrator for the Goosebumps books written by R.L. Stine. Alternatively, there's tons of other animators and voice actors and entrepreneurs and just cool people in the well of interviews for Meditations with Ryan Zlomek, so go give them a listen. If you're interested in finding me, you can find me at Ryan Zlomek on Instagram and TikTok. You can find The World of Ryan Zlomek on Facebook, and you can just give me a shout out, meditations@ryanzlomek.com. But most importantly, don't forget, especially as we're in this season of chaos and kindness, don't forget to make space for conversation, because you just might learn something. Have a wonderful, amazing, lightly spooky holiday season.